r/AskReddit. High school teachers of Reddit. What's the most awkward position a student has ever put you in? I had a student, male, freshman, 15, who was a great student. He got put into my remedial class mid-semester. Basically he'd been a trouble student in another class and he'd shown up to that class only a few weeks before because he'd previously been at another school. That's a minor red flag. But, in my class, great student. His biggest issues were that he was intelligent and the class really was below his level. Boredom often leads to poor behavior choices. 2. His home life was basically in the shitter. Without going into all the details, let's just say it was pretty bad. I brought a lot of this up with the school counselor. She did some digging, as much as she could, and confirmed a lot of it. But with an entire student body population, she didn't have much else she could do, since he wasn't an, and I quote, immediate danger. I brought it up with his former teacher, whose class he'd left, and she seemed to think that he just had issues with female authority figures, again, possibly stemming from the home. That's a red flag. She suspected it had something to do with his mother or older sister, but could never get anything out of him. After he'd been my student for a while, and I'd learned all of this, things were going fairly swimmingly, until he shows up one Friday during lunch, and says that he's come to say goodbye. That's a red flag. Getting him to talk, he basically says that he's hit a breaking point at home, and he's going to run away. He's got a girlfriend that he can probably convince to let him sleep over for a few nights while he gets things together, but 1, that won't last long, and 2, his mother will quickly find him there. His plan from there is basically to be homeless or to attempt suicide, which he rationalizes will either end the BS or at least get him a decent bed and a few meals at a hospital. I go through a bunch of mental checklists. I ask him to reconsider a few times. Eventually get him around to trying to reconcile with his mother for the sake of his younger brother, and ask him if just having a few days away from home might help. Reluctantly, he agrees. So, after school I took him home with me. He slept on the couch, did chores around the house and in the yard, was respectful to me and my wife and my own kid. We got him to call home on Friday, ended in a shouting match over the phone, and again on Sunday morning, much less shouting, but still some there. Told him that he'd need to go home on Sunday night, try to talk to mom face to face, gave him some de-escalation tips, drove him home. He was at school Monday and seemed fine. However, he still seemed agitated. His mom later wound up calling me repeatedly, accusing me of molesting her son and grooming him for molestation, and shouting and ranting. I told her that if she felt so strongly about it, that she could go to the authorities, but that I had weeks of documentation about his condition in addition to his own testimony. That I had the best interests of one of my students at the forefront, and if she had an interest in his health and future well-being, that she might want to re-examine her own relationship with her sons. Subbed for a high school Spanish class one day. A female upperclassman showed up during my planning hour looking for the normal Spanish teacher. After being informed of the teacher's absence, she stuck around and initiated small talk, claiming she was a teacher's aide in gym and wasn't needed on this day. Based only on my own instinct, she seemed a little too friendly for having never met me before. Just felt off right from the start. I propped my classroom door open and didn't really give her much feedback as I prepared for class, but she kept talking and it kept getting more personal. Without any prompting, she began explaining how she'd moved out of her parents' house. She appeared to be 16 or 17 and now lived with 3 college-aged males while she worked as a waitress at what sounded like a strip club. That's typically not the type of thing to open up to a random substitute teacher you met 5 minutes ago. She segued from that to men's fetishes and how some of the people she served had a thing for pregnant women. It seemed like she was angling to see if I'd open up about my own interests. That wasn't going to happen. I try to be a good listener for my students under most circumstances, but this one set off some alarms. I stood up, asked where the drinking fountain was, already knew, but needed an excuse, then promptly left the room, and didn't return until my planning hour had concluded. I left school that day wondering if I was just being paranoid or whether a girl with that kind of story is something I should have reported to the front office, or whether it's a home life thing and thus out of a school's control. One way or another, it probably tops the awkward teaching mountain for me so far. TL. Doctor, female high school student approached substitute teacher and began talking about life working at strip club, then tried to engage in conversation about sexual fetishes. Edit. To those wondering why I didn't report this student to someone, I'm with you. It's definitely something I'd change if I could go back in time. It's interesting how easy the answer can seem to be in hindsight. As a young teacher at the time, who was just visiting that school for the day, it was one of those experiences that helped build experience, so to speak. I left school that day with doubt as to whether I should have said anything to someone. It served as on-the-job training that when in doubt, tell someone. I was a long-term substitute in a rural high school right of college. I was teaching history and this girl, probably 16, was texting the entire time without letting up, even after I warned her repeatedly. Finally I confiscate the phone. The rule was, if your phone was taken, the only person who could get it back was a parent/guardian at the end of the day, due to the fact the school was dealing with the backlash of a major sexting scandal. During lunch I'm setting up a lesson for the next class and the girl comes back into the classroom and asks for her phone back, in which I tell her it was already turned into the office. At this point you can tell she is getting annoyed and asks me to call down and get it back for her, in which I tell her I can't. She begins to bawl, telling me that her parents were out of town until Saturday, and being that it was a 3-day weekend, the earliest she could get it back was Tuesday afternoon. I tell her I'm sorry for that, but the rules were the rules. After I tell her that, she immediately switches her tune and begins to ask me about my wife and son, and I tell her it is neither the time nor place to discuss it. With zero humor in her voice she looks at me in the eye and tells me if I call down to request her phone back she will give me a blowjob. Without skipping a beat I immediately reopened the door she closed and wait for the teacher across the hall to come into the room. When the teacher comes in, the student storms out in huff. I explain to the teacher what happened and immediately report it to the principal, who calls the girl in. When the principal and school counselor are talking to her, she admits that she offered to blow me and then says you must have hired a ref *****. Girl gets sent back to class and the principal calls the superintendent, and this snowballs all the way to a meeting with the student, her parents, school administrators and their lawyer the next week. Parents are obviously irate and accuse me of molesting their daughter, and luckily there was enough evidence to prove nothing happened. After the parents realize their daughter was the source of this massive embarrassment, they decide to pull her out and homeschool her. Luckily, I was only there for another week, but I decided to stop subbing after that. Not a teacher, but this happened to me in HS. I had this English teacher who I found very attractive. She was very sweet, and one of the qualities that I will never forget was her smile. Just seeing it made me happy, but also, she had huge tits. I was in high school, come on. Anyway, as a horned up typical high school dude, I couldn't help but have sexual fantasies play out in my head in the middle of class, especially when I was bored. It would range from experiences I had, porn, or any hot girl I wanted to do it with. Point is this: one day I was actually daydreaming about blowing her, and it was vivid too. I mean, my brain just knew how to create vivid porno in my head. It was horrible. Quite proud of how I can visualize, though. Getting off track. Obviously in doing this certain things could arise. Embarrassed I look down at my throbbing shame in hopes that no one in class sees it and flips out. As soon as I look up, something in my head tells me to look across the classroom, only to discover that my teacher is trying to look under the table to see what I was looking at. She was convinced I had an electronic device out and proceeded to interrogate me in front of the class. She goes, J. What do you have in your hands? It was my throbbing shame, to which at this point I'm clutching hard in hopes of extinguishing the shame. I look up and same as, it isn't what you think it is. She then made my greatest fear come true. Get up, she said. To which my throbbing shame decided to get even harder. I can feel my face get hot, so now I'm feeling embarrassment while I'm also turned on. and trying to figure out what to do next. Point all my high school brain could spit out was "Miss, I really don't want to do that." Point to which she retorted, "Jay, I need you to get up and move your hands and hand over that device or I'll send you to the office." Point the shame continued to throb. Point the class continued to stare. Point she then bolted towards me with annoyance written all over her face towards my desk. Point my heartbeat quickened. You could imagine how I figured that out. And she stopped right over me. "Move." Point your point hands. She thumped. Points if you know the reference. I didn't know what else to do. Point. So I closed my eyes and turned away at the same time I moved my hands. "Oh." She let out in a gasp. Point my eyes snapped open. Point oh. What do you mean no? I tried to look at her, only to see her eyes averting mine, and a pool of red washing over her face. Point she then stuttered out to the rest of the class. Yeah, they were watching, but had no idea what was going on. I returned to UHH the assignments you, and trailed off as she walked away. And that was the time my teacher saw my erection. Point she never looked at me again for the rest of the year. Not a teacher, but I have a very awkward story. We had an English teacher at our school. That student taught in our high school, then got the job as one of our middle school teachers. She was one of those short cute girls that looks kinda younger than she actually is, so naturally all the high school guys would just gawk over her. During her time student teaching, my older brother and some of his friends had noticed several times that her panties would peek over whatever pants she was wearing some days. One of my brother's friends, who was a known creep when it came to looking at the ladies, was able to snap a pic of one incident in the last few weeks before she was done teaching at the high school. Fast forward to when she got hired as a middle school teacher. I was in her class, which was a huge relief. Our other English teacher was god awful, and the photo had circulated all around the high school by then, and now was getting into the hands of the guys in my grade. Some idiot in my class, very creepily, had the photo printed and taped to the inside of the cover of his notebook for that class. One day, the cover gets too tattered and falls off in class. The teacher notices a picture. She gets betrayed and politely tells the kid to stay by after class. Once she understood the situation, since the kid obviously had to spill everything so he wouldn't be pinned as the guy took the creep shot, she became so embarrassed she started looking for a new teaching job. She left 2 years later after finding one. Really loved her class through. I got an A, and she said I had a knack for writing stories. I had a student that I taught in 7th grade, and he was my friend's, the librarian. Student Aid in 8th grade who had horrible hygiene, and he was often bullied for it. For his birthday we decided to create a shaving kit for him. We filled it with cologne, soaps, a razor and other items. We ordered a pizza and we decorated, closed the library, and had a small party to celebrate him. When he opened his gift he started to cry. At first we thought it was happiness, but it quickly escalated to sobs. We thought we offended him, and began to apologize. Through his sobs we finally made out. I thought it would make him stop. We looked at each other, and gently asked what he meant. Slowly the story emerged that his father had been sexually abusing him since he was 5, and he thought if he made himself as gross as possible his dad would stop. By law we had to call Child Protective Services, and we explained that to him. As I went to do that, my friend tried to console him. As it was his birthday, his mom showed up to pick him up early, arriving just after CPS. The caseworker let her in the room and the first words she said were, "Couldn't you just hold on for 3 more months?" It seemed she knew what was happening and was getting her LPN so they could move out. She had not worked before. This sad story does have a happy-ish ending. CPS in conjunction with our school social worker found them a shelter so they could stay together. The father was convicted and sent to prison, where he was eventually stabbed to death. Asterisk, I should have explained that mom was regularly beaten and told that she and son would be killed if they tried to leave. I'm not in any way excusing her behavior, just putting in the context. Edit spelling. Edit 2. Explanation. Also not a teacher, but being somewhat witty and always a wussy trying to get a laugh to make work enjoyable, I caused a few awkward moments among teachers. 11th grade English, a friend and I sat in the last 2 seats in the last row against a wall. Our teacher, Ms. Cannell we'll call her, was beautiful and was the center of many an inappropriate conversation between us. One day after getting stoned at lunch and not paying attention we got into it about her, apparently too toasted to notice how loud we were until the whole class laughed and interrupted her lesson. Cool as the other side of the pillow and with the sickest smirk ever responded without missing a beat on her teaching. By the way boys, I've heard everything you two have said about me all year. Yeah. It was one of the scariest, hottest, most awesome things ever. Another time, PG Eco, we had to do a 10-slide group PowerPoint on a president of choice. I selected JFK and my partner was basically non-existent for the project. Fast forward to the day of the presentation with 2 empty slides and down a handful of facts. I stumbled across his autopsy photos and used to as the last 2 slides with 1 page mostly about conspiracy theories of that day in Dallas and the last a Halloween recipe for jello brains. I got a 90 with -10 for not completing the task, but also bonus +10 for creativity, making the grade 100 for doing the project myself and because my teacher and I were both Tenacious D/Metallica fans. As a pointless side note, I'm pretty sure both of said teachers dated at one point, but I had already graduated. I moved to Mexico after uni. My job was to take rich people on sailing trips on the Pacific side. It's slow season. My girlfriend has just dumped me. I get a call from my friend from back home we has moved out to Mexico too, and he tells me there's a job going at this school he works at as an English teacher. I don't have any qualifications, but I figure it can't be any harder than sailing a rickety old boat so I think, fuck it, why not? I get to my new town on Friday morning. I meet the principal who barely speaks any English and me not much Spanish, but between us, we just about managed to establish that it's a Catholic school for girls and that I start on Monday. That night my friend tells me he's got a date. He wants to go to this club with her, but she can only go if she takes her cousin with her. Chaperoning is still a big thing in Mexico. He knows I'm still pretty cut up from my girlfriend ditching me and figures it might be good for me just to get back on the horse, as it were. Fast forward a few hours and his girl shows up in this new white Land Rover that looks like it's been boiled clean. I open the back door and her cousin is sitting there, and straight away, despite the fact she's heavily made up, it's fairly obvious that she can't be much older than 14. My friend is sort of apologetic, but he looks at me as if to say please, don't fuck this up for me, and his date for the night is pretty smoking. So I get into the car and I think I'll just go to the stupid club and once we get there I'll hang around in the smoking area and talk to a few randomers and then head home. Fast forward an hour and my friend tells me him and his date are going back to our place and would I mind just making sure her cousin gets home okay. I think fair enough. She's pretty young to be out and alone so I go find her. She's still nervous as hell and when I talk to her in the cab I start to realize she has learning difficulties. Nothing too severe, but she has this real glass-eyed look about her and she smells like she doesn't use deodorant. So I drop her off, I eat some tacos, I go back to my friend's apartment and I join and his date on the balcony and smoke some cigarettes. Fast forward to Monday and I've got this cheap suit and I'm kind of thinking I'm going to be Robin Williams from Dead Poets Society. When I get there they have a school assembly and introduce me in front of the whole school. There are lots of parents there and the school basically wants to show off because they have a native English teacher, which in this remote town is a big deal. I get into my first class and all the girls, 14 to 18 classes arranged in terms of ability not age, are all giggling and asking me what I did on the weekend, like they were privy to something. Anyway, I'm about halfway through the day and my friend is tapping erratically on my classroom door and he's smiling like all his Christmases have come early. I ask him what the hell he wants through gritted teeth, and he informs me that my date from Friday goes to this school. She's in the special needs class, and she's telling everyone who'll listen we went on a date. When school finishes I get called into the principal's office and my date is in there too with her teacher, who I assume has heard her story and taken it up with the principal. Neither of these women speak any English, and my Spanish is no way near good enough to furnish them with an explanation, which would cover the complexities that we went out on the premise of a date, but it wasn't an actual date. So in my panic I just completely throw her under the bus and say I've never seen her before in my life, which is believable as I've only been in town for a few days. I taught there for another 6 months and couldn't even bring myself to look at her. I still can't watch Dead Poets Society. This is a gross Port-a-potty story. Read with caution. My friend was in high school and on some sort of history trip with her history teacher and a young teaching assistant. My friend kept on playing with her phone despite her history teacher telling my friend repeatedly to put it away. Finally, the history teacher said something like, "If I see that phone one more time, there's no telling what I'm gonna do with it." During the trip, they are visiting an old army fort that is being remodeled and there are only porta-potties nearby. My friend wanted to use her phone, but was afraid of being caught. So she found an unused porta-potty and used her phone in there. When she was done, she tried to put her phone in her purse. It slipped and, you guessed it, fell into the potty. Even though the potty hadn't been used, she was still too grossed out to get it with her hand. So she ran to find the teacher or the assistant for help. It took her a long time, but she found the assistant inside one of the buildings. As they are leaving the building, to their horror they see the teacher leave the porta-potty and go around to the other side of another building. As my friend and the assistant are approaching the potty, my friend is saying repeatedly, "Please don't let what I think she did become true." It was true alright. The teacher had taken a dump on her cell. They were both grossed out, not wanting to deal with the situation. They both found the teacher. The teacher didn't believe them until they showed her the evidence. Mortified, the teacher proceeds to remove the cell with the help of a plastic bag and clean it off with tissues. But my friend refused to believe it wasn't on purpose. After what the teacher said to her on the bus, there was even a conference with her mom, the principal, the teacher, the assistant, and my friend about it. When I taught high school summer school, the principal had a policy of no passes during the day, since the kids were only in school for about 3 hours, and had a long break in the middle of it. We get back from the long break, and a young man immediately asks if he can go to the bathroom. I remind him of the no passes policy. He begins yelling at me about having an infection and needing to pee, and then threatens to piss on my desk. He went so far as to unzip his pants, which I heard more than saw, because I had turned away to get to the phone. The rest of the class is pretending to do silent sustained reading. I called the principal to either escort the student to the bathroom or out of the school for the day. When he heard the suggestion of escorting him to the bathroom, the student then began screaming about the principal wanting to see his dick and wanting to watch him pee. I'm pretty sure he got suspended for the rest of the day, and then I just acted like it never happened when he came back to class. I also worked in a juvenile detention center. There were a lot of rules and lingo that I was not familiar with, so the kids would sort of unintentionally put me on the spot. One day, my boys' detention class is writing a poem. This class is different every day, based on who was picked up the previous night and who is waiting for trial. It's not like the other groups that are constant for so many months at a time, with no change in the roster. Mainly, they're just made for interesting one-day lesson plans, but it also meant I didn't always know the class I was going to have or who would be in it. So sad to see the same kids come through after being released and then getting in trouble again. Anyway, this new boy chooses to write his poem about his grandmother. It was a form poem, and not that intense, but suddenly he is sobbing and asks me for a PTO. I have no idea what a PTO is at that point, and hearing the O, I think officer, and I'm like sure. Yes, I'll get someone. The students travel to class with a guard, so I turn to the guard for some help thinking we are having a real meltdown here. He just shakes his head and tells the kid no. I found out later that a PTO is a personal timeout, which the kid had been abusing all day to get away from the group and out of all sorts of typical juvie situations. But it seemed to me that he was really actually upset about the content of his poem. He wrote me a note on the assignment saying that he was sorry to cry like that, but he realized he might not get out to see his grandma again before she died. I never asked the kids why they were in, so I always figured maybe he just did something really awful and knew he was going to real prison after juvie. Although it was awkward at the time, I now have the claim to fame with my regular public high school students that I once made a kid in juvie cry. I have a couple. Had a 9th grade boy constantly causing shit in my class. Told him I would call his dad because of this, and the kid immediately having a panic attack. I mean, hyperventilating on the floor stuff. I relented and the next day the kid was pulling the same stuff. I called his dad. Didn't see the kid for the rest of the week. Came in the following Monday with a black eye and belt marks from his neck to his waist. Couldn't do PE for 3 weeks. Kid immediately started shit in my class again. Weird situation. Another boy came to class with claw marks on his arm from his best cheater. That one was weird. Last one was when I worked with kids with special needs. Not a high school, but they were old enough. Worked in the home of this family with 5 kids with autism. Had this one kid with severe behavioral problems, like hitting his head on things types of problems. He also didn't like to wear clothes and spent all of his day eating chicken nuggets and playing on his trampoline. He had killer abs for a 12-year-old. Anyway, we would have to hold him down when he was having behavioral issues, but we needed 2 people to do it safely. I showed up early to his house to see him beating his mother badly. I couldn't do anything but keep the other kids safe while his mother was getting bloodied because it would have been an illegal hold for me to do alone. Had to listen to this woman get bit and beat until my partner came 15 minutes later. Still feel bad about it. Sorry if any of that doesn't make sense. I'm not a writer, not a teacher, and I don't plan on ever being a teacher, but I was a student with a great story. 10th grade geometry. My teacher was absent, so we had a substitute. The substitute was supposed to go over the directions left by the teacher. It was basically a very brief math lesson, followed by a movie for the remainder of the class. For some reason the substitute thought it would be a good idea to scratch everything the teacher told him to do and instead talk about sex to a bunch of 10th grade geometry students. The teacher continued to tell us how he was a 35-year-old virgin waiting to meet his love and marry her. If it's not bad enough the teacher was talking to a bunch of 14-year-olds about sex when he should have been teaching math, the teacher wasn't the most appealing either. Tall skinny guy, round dorky glasses, with a bald head with a crown of hair. I don't remember much as I kind of zoned out as I didn't want to be a part of anything that was about to happen. In my head I knew that this was going to get him fired, and that was the last of the substitute teacher. He was fired immediately. The most awkward part is I see him almost every night when I cross the street when I leave work. I was a high school teacher walking a crowd of freshmen to the buses. I was in the middle of the pack. That's when I noticed one of the quietest and least assertive girls in the school was walking ahead of me with a huge blotch of blood soaking through the back of her pants. White pants. It was about the size of a big maple leaf. My heart about gave out. I briskly walked up behind her, yelled mercilessly at some roughhousing boys behind us so people would look at them, and then tried to stand there and shield her with my clipboard. She was just walking and crying these huge tears down her cheeks. I asked her to hold on a secretary, and I stood behind her trying to block as everybody walked past. I never said a word about the blood. I just told her we were gonna get her a different ride home today, and I was gonna get Mrs. G to come help us out. I don't even remember what else I said to fill the time, but that 3 minutes of standing there back to back with that student, waiting for Mrs. G, was the closest I ever came to crying in front of the kids, except the day I left. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe the channel.